Afternoon, everyone. My name is Bonitta Bennett, and I'm the director of the District 6 Museum, of which this Homecoming Center is part. And I'd like to welcome you to this very important conversation this afternoon. My words are going to be few, because I'm sure, like me, you are also very keen to get into the substance of the conversation. But I'd just like to say thank you to the partners, to Desiree, to the Dalla Omar Center, and to UWC, for including the District 6 Museum in this partnership and helping us to keep this Homecoming Center as a space of dialogue, which is so important in our city. It's named the Homecoming Center to remind us that part of our work is also about the return of the community to District 6, a really, really wonderful experience, but which has become very fraught and troubled over time. And we shouldn't be surprised, but sometimes I still am, at the number of issues linked to racism and exclusion that is still embedded in the returning community. So while we think about District 6 as having been this happy, diverse community who lived all together very happily before forced removals, sometimes we forget that most of the formation and the formation of the children and grandchildren of the District 6s was under apartheid, and they've grown up into internalizing these racial identities. So these conversations are very important, and it also reminds us that it is not only about District 6, it is much broader as well. So I look forward to the wonderful conversation, and I'm going to hand over now to Jaap, who will be the moderator for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonitta. Thanks for hosting us in this wonderful and inspiring venue. Good afternoon, my name is Jaap de Visser. I work for the Dalla Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape. And I'm equally honored to host this panel discussion, to moderate this panel discussion as part of the partnership between Desiree, the District 6 Museum, and the Dalla Omar Institute. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. The Homecoming Center is almost full, and that's fantastic. It also means that we clearly have a lot to talk about, because what is the meaning of race in current South African debates? What's the meaning of anti-racism? What's the meaning of anti-racialism? Is our outrage at Vicky Blomberg and Adam Katsavelos, is that enough to make us qualify as an anti-racist society? I would think not. What is the currency of race and the racial categories inflicted on us by colonialism and apartheid? Why are the terms colored, Indian, and Asian still taken by so many as an accurate reflection of a reality? Can we let go of them? Should we let go of them? Or are they still useful as forms of self-identity or as ways to seek redress and to pursue social justice? And perhaps, what about the Western Cape? Why do we often feel that it is, especially in this place, that we struggle the most with these categories? And how does race intersect with other aspects of our individual dignity, often used to separate and subjugate, such as gender and sexuality? Now, clearly we've survived a quarter of a century of independence and democracy without turning on each other. However, we're not the Rainbow Nation. So the question is, are we then nothing more than a multi-nation state? Are we a collection of distinct peoples condemned by the cruelty of history to live together? Or is there more? Is there questions we must ask ourselves to avoid that fate? So clearly we must be provoked, we must be prompted to think differently. And I'm very honored and in fact intimidated slightly with the panel that Desiree has put together for me to moderate. And I think it promises to be a very rich discussion. And hopefully we were able to grapple with some of those questions. So let me briefly introduce the panel to you. Desiree Lewis, in the middle there, a colleague from UWC, esteemed academic, writer, and mentor of feminist networks. She writes about feminism, gender, sexuality, and race. Asanda Ngoasheng lectures journalism at CPUT. She's a sought-after commentator and opinion maker and transformation expert, focusing on race, gender, and decolonization. Angelo Fick in the middle, Director of Research at ASRI and former resident analyst at ENCA. He spends most of his time reading, according to his bio, so we're not jealous at all. And then Rustem on the far left, Rustem Kozine is an academic and a poet and has a very impressive list of works and literary awards to his name. So a very impressive, strong panel that will engage with those questions. And let me also admit, I think it's very good that the white male member of this panel with Dutch roots must sit and listen. He may hold the clock, but he must let the adults speak. And I think that's how it should be. So the format that we're going to use is 10 minutes of brief introduction from each of the panelists, after which we'll have an engagement with the audience. And we should be able to finish around about 6, 6:15, so that we can each go our own ways. We're going to start with Rustem as the first introductory input, followed by Asanda, and then Desiree, and then Angelo. And I hope it's okay with you and with my panelists that I've dropped all the titles and surnames, and we just do it on a first-name basis. It makes the debate so much easier. So over to you, Rustem, 10 minutes for you.
Thank you, Jaap. I just want to make it clear that I'm not actually an academic, so I don't have that institutional machinery behind what I want to say. And I also don't have an impressive list of publications. I've only published 2 books of poetry. They're good books of poetry, you should buy them. So I want to start off with just a few general statements, and hopefully they will be provocative enough to trigger some meaningful conversation. So I speak firstly from an idealist anti-racist position, and I mean idealist in a common sense meaning, not in terms of idealist philosophy. But I speak from an anti-racist position rather than from a non-racial or a non-racialist position. And I think it's an important distinction to make if we consider, the 80s, the broad anti-apartheid struggle was often classified, especially the ANC's version of that anti-apartheid struggle was often classified as a non-racial struggle. So I reject the notion of race outright. I don't believe that there is such a thing as race, and I believe that working against racism should start from an anti-racist position rather than from a non-racial position, because non-racialism still accepts race as an intellectual category and concept, and that non-racialism seeks to counter racism by somehow, strangely and paradoxically, recognizing race. I'm very much aware that my position is outside of the mainstream, that it's heterodox, and that it's utopian, and that in reality, people behave as if race exists. Of course, racism is real. So I'm very much aware that belief in this fiction has real-world effects. But so, as an anti-racist, I am, of course, exhausted by how racism persists following the demise of apartheid. But also, and more importantly, I am exhausted and depressed by the persistence of race in language, in our language and in our thinking, by how we continue to grant race such a primary and powerful explanatory power. And I'm skeptical that we will resolve this. So let me be clear and repeat. I'm aware of and almost every day experience racism, and thus, and by extension, the power of racial thinking. This persistence, I believe, is due to the fact that, among many other things, we continue to use the language of race. The post-apartheid state and its citizens have simply taken up the old apartheid and colonial states' categories of administration, which I find absurd. In its endeavors, whether those endeavors are successful or not, But in its endeavors to right the racist injustices of apartheid, the post-apartheid state has paradoxically entrenched in its people the very ciphers by which the colonial and apartheid bureaucracies sought to mark us. So it's a sour joke to remark that after all, apartheid was or has been successful because it has its language of race embedded in our psyches. Race is now an almost instinctual lens through which we look at almost everything we do, or we say, or we think. I can understand, for the sake of bureaucratic ease, or perhaps bureaucratic laziness, the post-apartheid state has taken up wholesale an apartheid bureaucratic discourse and made it its own. But it's no wonder then that we cannot escape the language and the behavior of the old apartheid state. It is easy to simply invert old hierarchies, but it's hardly transformation if we still rely on the very psychic foundations on which apartheid depended. So we should note with irony that in a time when we describe so much power to language and discourse, and we encourage and campaign for people to be aware of the psychic violence that language can carry, it's ironic that we continue to use the discourse of race to understand, to describe, and analyze the world. So I'm not surprised that racism itself persists and is becoming even more prevalent. Surely it's connected to the general acceptance, as if real, of a fiction, race. Of course, in the Western Cape, we're also seeing the weird, and in my book, almost perverse celebration of the label colored. And it's with a big irony that in the context of our times where we have become so sensitive to the valences of power that language carries and deploys, that people have grown comfortable and have grown even proud of the label colored. I reject the term colored with utter contempt. I reject it because it is an apartheid category, and I also reject it because of Steve Biko's writings. I reject it also because in its very constitution as a part of language, in its very deep linguistic sense, it robs me of my agency. People laugh when I say that I reject the term colored because it is a past participle. We know it as a noun, as a word that describes a group of people. But if we think about it carefully, we'll realize that as a past participle, in a sentence, it robs a supposed agent of their agency. So the word is derived, a past participle is the form of a verb that is often used generally to describe the past tense, but also it is used often in the passive voice of when a sentence is turned into passive voice. So I'll make it clearer by simply comparing it to other racial categories in South Africa, and if we turn those racial categories itself into past participles. If we think of a sentence like he is colored, okay, it's a normal sentence. Colored there is a past participle. If we contrast and compare that to a sentence like she is blackened or he is whitened, then we see what I'm talking about when I say that colored is a past participle. So I reject the label because I find that in the language of that category, there's already a contempt towards me as a person, as someone who has agency. If language and discourse are these powerful entities that shape us and our reality, the term colored is a term that robs its referent, the person it refers to, of agency and turns the referent into a passive object, something to be acted on rather than a subject with agency. So why celebrate a term that robs you of your agency? I reject this term because I'm an actor in this world. I'm an agent and not an object waiting to be acted on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That certainly set us off on the debate. Really problematizing the language of race and the use of the word colored, and looking very deeply inside the linguistic aspects of it. I think a very powerful start of the debate. Let's go to Asanda.
I think that's quite a tough act to follow. In part because I, on the other hand, identify as black first and everything else after. And I believe this because I believe that for as long as we live in a society and a world that treats us as black before human and before everything else, then my identity will continue to be rooted in my blackness. I think that South Africa is sitting in a wonderful place because for the first time in a long time we have the opportunity to challenge, to question, to unpack, to decolonize, to deconstruct everything we thought we knew and everything we thought we understood. In my opinion, what happened in 1994 is that we got to a moment in time where we had to decide and we had to think about how do we come together and become one nation. And that is how the very obviously failed experiment of the Rainbow Nation came to be. The problem that we face at the moment is largely based on the fact that although the attempt at creating one nation was based on the wrong premise of a rainbow nation, at that particular point in time, there was at least an attempt to forge a nation. What we're facing now is a political, social situation where there is very little by way of trying to think about and understand what it means to be South African and what it is that we have in common in spite of all of these differences. What we are beginning to see instead is attempts to move away from race, but not in the healthy, anti-racist way, but in a very unhealthy way, like calling Heritage Day Braai Day, because apparently that's the only culture that we have in common. Or as somebody else said to me last week, that white people only have the braai as their culture, which I find hilarious because we are living in whiteness and walking in whiteness and talking in whiteness and engaging in whiteness on a daily basis in South Africa. And yet when it comes to the one day where we have the opportunity to potentially engage about what whiteness, blackness, and whatever other constructs you want to think about mean, we are told that the very center and the very essence of who we are forced to be, or who we are forced to engage as an antithesis of, is said to be only based on the culture of the braai. So why are we continuing to have conversations about race and center race and question race, et cetera, et cetera? Why is it still important in this post-apartheid, post-millennial era? It is important because one of the things that rainbowism robbed us of is the opportunity to dig at the wound of apartheid and to dig and to clean and to do a very thorough clean and to get a sense of understanding of who we are as individual groups and as a nation in completeness. And I think this moment that we are in is pivotal because we are for the first time presented with that opportunity. One of the most seemingly controversial aspects of this opportunity has, of course, been this question around what is known as the colored question, colored identity, the place of Indians, the place of Asians, so-called colored, the Kamisa people, the de-Africanization or the re-Africanization of identities. And the interesting thing for me is that I arrived from Johannesburg about 4 years ago to teach at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. And because I had lived in Johannesburg, I didn't know Cape Town, which is funny. And I think if I had known Cape Town, I probably would have taken a different approach than I did. But, I was like this, Eastern Cape born, spent enough years in Joburg to kind of think of myself as this cosmopolitan African. And I found myself in a country, because Cape Town is a country, that was European in its makeup, with some hidden African. And I began to ask myself, as a person, tasked with teaching political reporting, what is it that I can teach students about politics, particularly in the Western Cape? Because we know that the Western Cape has different politics to anywhere in the country, in part because it's run by the DA, but also in part because Cape Town has the most unique racial makeup in South Africa, which is that it's majority colored, and also it has the largest constitution of white people in South Africa. So this is the white congregation center of South Africa, essentially. And this has an impact on how we, as Cape Townians, or as people living in Cape Town, get to experience the city and get to think about the city. And I think it seeps into the essence of what it is to be in Cape Town and what it is to live in Cape Town or experience Cape Town. And so I began the very foolish notion of getting my half-colored, half-African students to engage on the issue of the colored identity and to engage on this creeping, unspoken, taboo topic of the conflict between so-called colored people and so-called African people and its roots. And I was surprised by the responses where parents came to the HOD and said I was being racist and I was being divisive and I didn't deserve to teach or deserve to be in front of young people trying to shape them. But once we had gotten over the fact that I actually don't care about being fired because I'm just that kind of person, I was then able to get into the very interesting nitty-gritties of what exactly the colored question is as experienced and thought about by young people. And I was very surprised because I spend a lot of time with older colored friends who are of the Black consciousness movement belief and who self-identify as Black. And what I found is that because there was an era in which concerted efforts were made to educate people about Black consciousness and what it means for all people of color, they become quite impatient about the need and the importance of engaging, particularly young people, about this colored identity and what it is. And what I found is that a lot of young people, particularly colored and Black as well, are very interested in understanding the genesis of this term colored, are very interested in understanding the genesis of our common humanity or our common Blackness. But parents are not willing to have those conversations. The hurt is deep, we know, because you can't unpack certain identities without talking about slavery, without talking about indentured labor, and without talking about a whole lot of painful stuff that sometimes it's just easier for people to not discuss and engage. And so for me, it's critical and it's important that we continue to be obsessed with race until race continues to not be an issue. And I think that the last thing I just wanted to add quickly was that we are seemingly in turmoil, but I'm seeing, as somebody who engages with young people of different races, very interesting and beautiful notions of identity that are emerging. And I'm finding that the biggest mistake that we make as parents, and I include myself because I'm a parent, is that we don't engage our children about what it means to embody the skin that they're in. We don't engage them and we don't equip them for the assaults they are going to confront outside. And this goes across races. And so black people or people of color in general don't tell their children what it means to embody this brown skin and how that will have visceral and quite strong reactions from people. And white people don't engage their children about the white skin that they embody and the problem of whiteness and how it gets read by everybody that they encounter. And so you have young people who are constantly and continuously hurting each other, who, although they grow up in diverse schools, universities, and therefore race, in a sense, doesn't matter, continue to use the language that they're being taught at home and therefore continue to hurt each other. And so for me, my interest in race and racism is really about how do we talk to the past, engage the past, deconstruct the past in a way that allows this current generation to be rooted deeply in their history, to be rooted deeply in that pain, while also being able to look forward and engage as people with strong roots and a strong sense of centeredness that makes them able to embody their identities without erasing others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asanda. That was equally powerful, and I sense a slight shift in emphasis from, I think the skepticism of Rustam, and then going to an argument that maybe the hurt legitimizes the use of the label. So I think that's an interesting contradiction that we should perhaps not lose sight of. But let's go to Desiree. Your thoughts, please.
Thank you, Angelo, for inviting me. Maybe just to start off with, I'm extremely glad that this panel is titled Unmaking the Past, Making the Future, because I think so often the tendency is to think critically about race and racism in terms of unraveling what is past, and to assume that that unraveling and deconstruction is the same as being productive. There is a sense in which there's something that comes after the unraveling, or there's some vision that should guide our unraveling. And I think that's very often implicit in the way that people sometimes use the word decolonization, as though somehow to get rid of something is to also build. And of course, I don't think that's necessarily the case. Anyway, having said that about the title, I'm going to try and position myself somehow in relation to both Rustam and Asanda, and hope that I don't get horribly lost. And I think a way to start this would be, I've been thinking more and more about many critics' use of the term neo-racism. And neo-racism is being used as a term that distinguishes how racism is articulated in the present from racism in the past, in the sense that no longer is there a focus on sort of biological, phenotypical, so-called genetic differences. The focus now comes to fall on what are seen as cultural differences. So articulating differences, very often hierarchically, through the language of culture is obviously more palatable, because you're not saying, you are innately inferior. You are saying there's something about the way in which you were raised, there's something about your cultural upbringing that makes you somehow not fit in. And I've been finding that discourse, that new discourse of race, that new language of race articulated through cultural difference, very prominent both globally and in South Africa. Globally, the term that's used to kind of support this racial language of race is the term multiculturalism. So multiculturalism is seen as a sort of a philosophy which informs policy, which informs all sorts of practices for opening up spaces for minorities. So multiculturalism is very pronounced in the global north, in places like Canada, Germany, and so on, where there are lots of immigrants who come in, and then the claim is that, we are multicultural. But the disturbing thing about multiculturalism, and this is where we realize that multiculturalism actually repeats the language of race, is that very often the assumption is that certain cultures are somehow behind. So you don't actually have an explicitly judgmental way of thinking about cultures, but there's a kind of implication that certain cultures are older, they're static, that's a very common idea. So just to make it more concrete, in Germany, for example, when many Germans speak about Turks, they'll speak about Turks as immigrants who have cultures that somehow don't change, and somehow they are kind of connected to, belong to their cultures in a way that makes their behavior irrational. So that notion of the irrationality of certain groups is very central to these new discourses of race. And we find that it's interesting that the whole discourse of multiculturalism has surfaced very much in the wake of 9/11. And as a way, in a sense, of almost sort of reinforcing and endorsing Islamophobia, the idea that these groups somehow don't think rationally, they're driven by their instincts, they're driven by their upbringing, by a sense of loyalty towards each other, unlike those in the West, who somehow, interestingly enough, are not seen to have cultures. You know, they are sort of cultureless. So for me, I think it's important for us to think about the shifts in racial discourses, not because it means that things are becoming better, far from it. Very often I think things are becoming worse, but somehow it's become more persuasive, more insidious. The moderator spoke about the currency, the ongoing currency of race. And I think if we pay attention to the way in which it's articulated, that helps us quite a lot. In South Africa, I've been speaking about sort of trends globally, but I think it's important also. South Africans often don't think about their racial discourses in relation to global patterns, and I think very often South African trends in identity politics, for example, draw quite a lot on global patterns. But in South Africa, there's always been a very strong emphasis on cultural differences as somehow being synonymous with these so-called racial differences. And we find that not only in right-wing thinking, but also on the left. So a lot of identity politics is driven by the idea that I need to defend and protect my culture. And the assumption is almost as if this is some fixed thing that's sort of imprinted in my genes that I have to defend. So while I don't quite endorse Rustam's cynicism, because I do believe that there is a need to claim and strategically use the language of race. Not because I believe that race exists, I don't think it's an either-or thing, but because race has been mobilized politically. And in order to deconstruct certain power relations, one needs to strategically and tactically use the term. At the same time, I am concerned with the kind of trend that Asanda is talking about, which is the sort of sense of absolute joy and pride in embracing one's identity, because I think so often that leads to a situation where claiming identity becomes an end in itself. And after you claim that identity, what? And very often also, why is that so important at this moment? Again, to invoke the global context, it's interesting that the claiming of identity, not only in terms of race, but also in terms of sexual orientation, has become sort of the be-all and end-all of many struggles. And that feeds very much into a global neoliberal environment where we are encouraged to think about ourselves as these beings who simply need to kind of lay claim through rights discourses to identities. We need to own them, and that's it. And of course, we stop thinking about transformation in broader terms, in terms of economic justice, in terms of sort of broader structural issues. So I think I will stop there. I think I'm lost enough now. Thank you.
Thank you, Desiree. I really like the last point that you made about identity never being a singular issue. You never just defined by race. You're always defined by many other things, such as religion, whether or not you support abortion, what your language you speak. There are so many other aspects to identity, and often the debates that we have lay an undue claim on one or two of the other. Now, obviously, the sort of a nuanced debate that we're having here is often not the way politicians engage with the issues, and I have a suspicion that Angelo is going to take us there. Over to you, Angelo.
Thank you. So for me, the story of race in South Africa is a story that is a ghost story. It is a story of spirit possession. And partly because, as all three of the previous panelists, my colleagues on the panel, spoke about, race is constructed in everyday actions and in language. So the apartheid and colonial definitions of us in racial categories happened in language. So you can still go to the Population Registration Act, you can Google it, and it's a kind of psychiatric cabaret of what you do with language. That something is something because it isn't another thing, because it's generally accepted to be that thing. Now, if you described apples like this, an apple is generally an apple if it isn't an orange, but is generally accepted to be an apple, except when it isn't an apple. You would have no idea what an apple is, right? If somebody described this object to you by saying, it is this thing that's generally accepted to be this thing, except when it isn't accepted to be this thing, then it's this other thing. Just as you're listening to me, it's complete gibberish, it's nonsense. But people read the 1950 Population Registration Act, and they made sense of it and operationalized it and ran a country according to this gibberish. And it wasn't just that this gibberish was being forced onto other people like cookie cutters. People were being asked to identify inside this gibberish because it meant the difference between where you lived, whether you got a pension, whether you got a civil service job, whether you became a teacher or a domestic servant, whether you lived in a brick house or whether you lived in a zinc house, whether you were allowed in a city or whether you were endorsed out, whether you carried a dompas or whether you didn't. And so there I think Rustam and I are on the same page around this issue of it had real material consequences, this terrible ghost. And those consequences are inherited like you inherit a ghost in your house. If the people who teach you to believe in ghosts leave you a house that they say is inhabited by a ghost, very little is going to convince you that there isn't a ghost in this house. And race, for me, is that kind of ghost. We have had more than a century of scientific scholarship disproving the biological construction of race, this idea that race is real. We have had at least 50 years of critical race theory, that very thing dismissed by a senior politician in this province who has probably read, I think, if I'm being generous, maybe 3 pieces of critical race theory, but dismisses an entire field. My second analogy for race is that it's not just a ghost story, it's a story of an epidemic. Let's think of a biological problem, tuberculosis. If you wanted to understand what to do about tuberculosis, who would you talk to? Your politician? Only people with TB? Various people who live on a road where there are people with TB? People who once sat in a taxi where somebody coughed and suspected that person of having TB? No. You would talk to the people who've studied tuberculosis. If there is an infection agent in your water, who would you deal with? You would not hold a democratic plebiscite and go, let's vote on how to fix the water. You would go, do we have an epidemiologist? Do we have a microbiologist? Do we have people who deal with water? What is the problem here? We have had scientific scholarship on race and racism for half a century at least. But whenever we want to talk about racism, we think anybody can make a statement. You don't need to have read anything, you don't need to have studied anything. You can ignore 50 years of scholarship and still go, oh, I know how we resolve racism. We just need to stop talking about it. I know how you can stop TB. Just take cough syrup. You'll stop coughing. Right? So we treat symptoms but not underlying causes because we ignore what's out there, the knowledge. And we take information and mistake it for knowledge. So when we talk about race, my question is often whose terms are we using and on whose terms are we talking about race? I think politicians are the least well-placed people. They're probably the second worst people to talk about race productively. And this is where I want to tie in with Desiree's idea. It's this fixation that race is only made in the past. And somehow we only have race in the present because we've inherited it from the past. We're not making and remaking race every day. And so if we want to unmake race, all we have to do is unmake the past. And we did that in 1994. We all woke up, went and voted, and somehow we were new people on the 28th of April. Now we know we weren't new people because the spatial logics of the world that made race and in which race was made were not unmade. And we have done very little over the last generation, and it is a generation now, to unmake those spatial logics. So we shouldn't be surprised that race persists, because the very material on which it was made, and which it in turn made, continues to persist. A child born in Hanover Park today is a child born in Hanover Park today. That sounds like a quotidian thing to say, but that child's life chances are determined by having been born in Hanover Park, and she is born in Hanover Park because of that history, but also because of the present. Because over the last 25 years, we haven't unmade where poor people live in our cities. So I'm using the Cape Town example, but I can use similar examples for Durban, for Pietermaritzburg, for Bloemfontein, for Johannesburg. So this is not a single Cape Town out, but we're in Cape Town, so let's talk about the space here. We have an event in November in Durban. We will talk about Durban then. So when we think of race, it has consequences, like any ghost. If you believe there's a ghost in your house, even if the ghost isn't real, and I believe the ghost isn't real, it has consequences. If there's a room in your house that you can never go because that's where the terrible monster lives, it shapes which spaces you can move into. It probably shapes how you move in the dark. Robert Miles, who is a seminal scholar for me of moving beyond what are called race relations. I think race relations takes me back to the 50s. It's time to move beyond the 1950s. Race relations are gone. Let's talk about racism, which is the consequence of race. And in that sense, I don't believe in non-racism or non-racialism. I fully believe it's anti-racism, which is active work against racism to unmake it and undo it, which is not to deny that race has consequences, but it's to go, let's deal with racism. We can deal with race separately, but let's first deal with racism. I don't believe criminalizing it is going to help it. All sorts of things today are criminalized, and people still double park. So really, criminalizing it is not enough. It might be important, but it's not enough. There are social sanctions. If we can't get rid of pedophilia simply by ostracizing pedophiles, because we're not ostracizing them, we're not getting rid of gender-based violence against women because we're not ostracizing those people. It's not enough to fine people or put them in prison. There's something else that has to be done. And it is the actual work of unmaking the language that makes race today. It's pointless unmaking the language that made race in 1950. We can all be cynical about the gibberish from 1950, but can we be as cynical about the gibberish of 2018, in which we continue to construct identities for people that they may not self-identify in? Secondly, educate people into identifying themselves inside categories that don't exist, and thereby failing to do the imaginative, productive work of making people see the other possibilities of how they can construct identity that doesn't require racialized thinking. You may have things in common with the other people because you're all poor, but if you're being divided by a category constructed in 1950 that doesn't apply in 2018 in the same way, there are consequences. To deny that things happened in 1950 is also not useful. And here I think of Ruth Frankenberg. Color evasion is pointless because we live in a world where color matters. And I don't just mean literal color, though that sometimes matters too, whether you get a job in the front of reception or whether you're being asked to work in the back. Do you get to be the face of the campaign or do you not get to be the face of the campaign? Frankenberg talks about color evasion. We say, oh, it doesn't matter. And you hear this in people's language where they say things like, oh, it doesn't matter to me whether people are black, blue, pink, or purple. And I'm like, if you've seen blue and pink people and purple people, there's a problem. Right? Then there's the issue of language around white and black. No one is literally white and black. So already there's a metaphor. So when people say things like, my black skin, I go, you don't have black skin. If you did have black skin, I'd rush you to an emergency unit immediately because there would be something very wrong with you. So you're talking about how the phenotype, which is now called blackness, is used in a particular way. And here I'm with Robert Miles. Let's stop using race and let's start looking at how race is used, which are two very different projects. Because once we can start doing that, we can start being critical. And then there wouldn't be this unexamined racial position, which is often still the case in South Africa. It is what I see when I hear politicians dismiss any study of whiteness. You go, no, that's critical race theory, that's gunk, that's rubbish. And you go, firstly, you've never been in a critical race theory classroom, you've never read anything, so let's just dismiss epidemiology. It's gunk. I prefer chewing gum. Okay, that's nice, go ahead, chew gum, die. You shouldn't be in a position where you determine that everybody else must chew gum, because that means everybody else dies, right? So what happens when we do the work of race? There is the dehumanization, and then there is the attempt at rehumanization. So I think I will become more fully human through this category, because in the world, these categories have consequences. But if the category is a ghost, you're trapped in a relationship with a thing that isn't real. And this, for me, is the failure of the imagination. We need to think beyond old terms, and we need to identify current terms that trap us in the dialectic of thinking difference is hierarchized, because difference will often bring resources. Science and politics, they often are not even in the same house, they don't live on the same street. Politicians and scientists have very different timelines. Politicians have their eye on the next election, which is maybe 5 years from now. Scientists have a much longer view back into the past and into the future. So this idea that the people who think and talk and write about race and critical race theory are dismissible by politicians who only have to worry about getting elected or re-elected next year is something that I think we need to start informing ourselves as citizens, as human beings, is not the thing to do. Race is a performance. We all perform it on occasion. And we perform it whether we want to not be read in a particular way or read in a particular way. And politicians use those performances to make them seem natural. And I think it's important for us to denaturalize race, to take it away from this idea that it's simply there. When I walk into a room, I can spot what people are. Well, maybe I should walk into a room and go, how many errors do I make? Because I assume people who look a certain way will speak a certain language, will have certain values, will have certain tastes, will like hot food in a particular way, will be able to dance, etc., etc. 19 out of 20 times I might be right, but how do I explain the 20th part? And increasingly, 7 out of 8 times I'm wrong. So when we come to this position that I'm talking about, it's important for me to go through not color evasion, but also not power evasion. So not to pretend that we haven't had a world that was constructed in raced terms. That world needs to be deconstructed. So yes, the spatial logics of our spaces that we live in, that needs to be undone. What languages are valued, that needs to go. Why are people learning French? Why are we, my child's doing German, second language. Your child lives in a space where the majority of the people speak is Sesotho. But your child has 3 words of Sesotho. What does that mean? What is that child being educated into understanding the world to be? How often does that child see you speak in the language that you say should be valued to other people? I'm interested in I think, and this is my closing, I'm moving towards my closure, Ruth Frankenberg's notion of race cognizance, which is to admit that there were consequences and are consequences in the present, and to try and make them differently. So to say that it shouldn't matter in the way that it currently does, and that needs work. So where a child is born shouldn't determine who they are read as. Who they are read as shouldn't determine what languages or aspirations they should have. And from the child through to the adults. TB should be identified when it occurs as the cough. We shouldn't keep giving it cough syrup, which is what the politicians keep feeding us. We should identify it for what it is, and that means special tests. Listening to the people who've studied the phenomenon. And stop doing the work of race, because if you do the work of race, you're one step towards the racism already. If you haven't done the work of race, you can't be racist. But the work of race is natural. It's like the air that we breathe. It's what we've been taught to do. And that means all of us have to unlearn stuff from the past. Old bad habits, including the very terms we use to describe people who were never defined by those terms. Why should someone who was born in 2010 continue to be defined by terms from 1950 that we said we abolished in 1994? And it's not to say that that shouldn't play part of our redress debate. But when we look at people, why do we say, well, this person's Indian? How do we know? And if they identify as Indian, have they been given any other opportunities in this stifled society to think of themselves in other terms? Because I might think of myself as a fantastic tap dancer, but this room will very quickly point out to me that I am wrong. Why are we so reticent to point out to people who are so married to these terms that they're not productive, that they're not useful? We have gone through that experiment once before in the 1970s and 80s in South Africa. Histories are important for me, but the present and the future matter, and we need to reimagine the future by knowing what the history is so that we don't repeat it, because it would be tragic to repeat history. I hate to quote Marx in this space, first as tragedy and then as farce. We've already repeated it as tragedy in post-apartheid South Africa. In post-millennial post-apartheid South Africa, we shouldn't repeat it as farce. So when politicians get up on podia and start racially identifying people and getting it wrong 7 out of 8 times, we should call them out for the farcical coonery that they are doing. And I'm using the word coonery specifically. I'm thinking here in closing of Zoe Wickham, who says in a collection of stories which was published, and in one story in particular, another story, she says, lexical vigilance is a matter of mental hygiene, a regular rethinking of words in common use, like cleaning out rotten food from the back of a refrigerator when no one expects food to rot and poison to the rest. We have a lot of rotten food in our society, and it means that every one of us need to stop, think more carefully about the language we use every day, because it's become a habit of thought, and the habits of thought have consequences in habits of being, and habits of being have consequences in the actions we perform upon the world and the people in it. So we need to think differently, and that is unmaking the past and the present, and rethink the future productively, other ways of being with one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelo. My 10-year-old daughter came to me a few weeks ago and asked me, "Daddy, am I white or am I colored?" And I resented myself for not having a clear answer, even though I had been preparing for this question for 10 years. But I also resented the fact that she was forced by society to ask that question. And I think that's the point that you're making very forcefully. Thank you very much for that. So I think we've had a very rich set of inputs, taking us from the skepticism of Rustam on the deconstructing the language of race, to perhaps the hope of still seeking legitimacy in the hurt that has been inflicted through racism. The shifts in the debates, also globally, that Desiree pointed out, to a way forward of not looking at race, but looking at racism and beating the ghost that we all seem to believe in, or society wants us to believe in. It's time to bring you into the debates. We have quite a bit of time for discussion, and I'd like to invite you to raise a question, make a comment, agree, disagree with the panelists. There should be some roving mics that can be used to collect questions. So can I have a few hands? I'll collect a few questions and then invite the panel to respond. And if you have a question that's specific to one of the panelists, please indicate so, but also feel free to make general inputs. Anyone with a question or an input? I see one hand there in the back. Is there anyone else? Otherwise, we'll come as we proceed. I see one there in the middle. Is there a third one? I don't see a hand, but there. Right, number 3. And there, okay, I've got you. So we've got number 1, number 4, number 3. Sorry, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Let's start with number 1 at the back.
Hello. Good evening. My name is Lorna. I'd just like to make a comment and then a question. My comment is, as somebody who's spent a lot of energy in her life trying to not use labels to describe myself, I find that is a very difficult thing to do, personally. But I also find that other people do not understand you when you try to do that. And it's really a reflection of what all the panelists have said, that this is so insidious and people are not conscious. So when we speak about decolonizing the mind, for me, that is what it's about. You know, it's not, and decolonization in general, it's not only about the structures, but it's also about the way that I think and what I am thinking. And unfortunately, as a society, we still, in this country, even as people are protesting all over the place, our sense of solution is outside of ourselves. And so I think that is what I concluded about the way that I engage with people sometimes, that people don't understand it because they don't see that the way that I think is part of the way to solve the problems and change the world, that we're looking externally for solutions. So my question is related to something I've been thinking a lot about as we encounter regularly in our country issues relating to race. I feel that race, the problem of racism is significant in South Africa. Of course, everybody's presented that quite clearly, the impact thereof. But there's a serious issue about class, and I feel that the way that people discuss race without discussing class, is in fact obscuring a very significant challenge that we face. And racism in South Africa is really used to sustain a working class and an underclass. And so for me, that's a part of the conversation I would have liked to have heard more about, and I'd like to hear from the panelists about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Lorna. Number 2 here in front.
Hello, I'm Ayanda. I just wanted to ask Asanda, first of all, with regard to the colored question that you asked your students, I just wanted to know what kind of replies did you get from your students? Because I think now what I'm seeing on social media is that a lot of people who identify as colored who are my age, so between the ages of like 21 and 24, are talking about colored identity and what it means to be colored. And there's also this kind of interesting move between, or maybe not move, but there's a, colored people want to kind of define what it means to be colored, but they don't want anybody else to define it for them. And there seems to be this kind of friction between colored people and black people, whereas black people tell colored people, no, you are black, and colored people say, no, we would like you not to tell us what we are and let us define ourselves. So yeah, that's my question. And then with regard to abolishing the language or not using the terms colored, black, I asked to the rest of the panel, with regards to South Africa's past and with regards to reparations, how would the people who were, how would we go about reparations without using those terms? What language would we use to frame that if we're not going to use colored and black and white? So, yeah.
The question at the back, the first question is about economic redistribution. Sorry.
No, it's fine.
Can I respond?
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, you know, the first question is an important question because the assumptions behind all I say about race and racism is that the issue is about economic redistribution. The state exploits the language of race cynically because it has to stay in power. Now, you can redistribute economic resources without having recourse to racial language. Because if you say, this group of people earn only 5,000 Rand a month, then you have an objective measure by which you can say, we should do something to help those people. Classifying the people by racial terms means nothing in terms of their, because I mean, I just find it absurd that we need a racial language to identify an economic problem, okay? Because we can all, you know, the state has access to bank accounts, etc. You can see who doesn't earn a lot of money. You don't need a racial classification to understand who is poor, okay? And the issue of class oppression gets confused because apartheid and colonialism has grafted race onto a particular power dynamic, okay? And we are just falling back into that trap. And my point is that the state who should be the leader in something like social programs that can address these issues are doing nothing about it, and it's just using that bureaucracy because it's easy, okay? The thing is, people are divided more by class, and we can argue about this. People are divided more by class than they are divided by these invented labels, okay? Because a poor colored person will have more in common with a poor black person than they will have in common with a middle class colored person. And that's something that people miss. And you know, I mean, that's an opportunity for activists, for instance, to kind of overcome racial division by organizing, you know, solidarity along class lines. Sorry, I'm going on, but I mean, those are the assumptions behind my kind of, you know, desire or my depression with the fact that the language of race is still so persistent in South Africa.
Thank you, and it's really not a problem. We need to keep the debate lively. But we're going to take 2 more questions and then go back to the rest of the panel. At the back there, number 3, please go for it.
Hi, sorry, I'm just going to step aside so I can see everybody. My name is Kafui, and my question and also remark and observation is that when it comes to discussions about race, I'm not a South African, I'm Ghanaian, and I was raised in Europe and then moved here to Cape Town. And my observation is that when it comes to this issue that we are speaking about, that depending on where in the world you are, there are different terms and different ways of addressing them and different terms that are used to define the issue. What I've also observed specifically in South Africa is that when it comes to this issue, seminars like these, what I notice is that most of the people engaging and addressing these issues are people of color. That's a term that I use for whether you're black or colored or Indian or anything else. My question is, how do we really address issues like these when spaces like these are filled with mostly people of color engaging in conversations like these? And how do we really get to the bottom of issues, whether it's based on economical issues or race issues, however you want to define them? How do we really address these issues when most of the spaces are not, when most of the people, for example, white people in this country, are not actively trying to engage in conversations like these? It's a difficult issue to change when people of color are mostly the people doing the work when it comes to this.
Thank you. And then number 4 here in front.
Good evening, I think. Good evening. My name is Lindumzi Komle from the Eastern Cape, like Asanda. Grew up in the rural areas. And when I came to Cape Town, as she said, you come to a different country altogether. It's something different. And you really can't really understand how people really think here and do things. But I want to start with what Angela said. He said that we need to stop using race and look at how race is being used, which is very critical and crucial in this time and age. Because anyone today, if you go to, when I was at university some time ago, you go to either UCT, you go to VETS, or you go to Rao, then you go to Stellenbosch, they were white universities. And your chances of success as a black person were almost to nil. If you're doing a 3-year degree, you would finish it maybe in 5 years. Not really, not because of that you are not brilliant enough, because of the situation, because of the environment, the way you see yourself, the way you are treated, and the way the salient sort of way of being treated in an inhuman manner. And as a student, you say to yourself, do I have to be here? Do I fit here? Do I have to fight or flee? What do I do? And in that manner, racism, race was being used in a way to show that you don't belong here, basically. It still happens in some areas and spaces as we speak. I remember I was once in another sort of forum like this forum, and a question was asked if there are students, let's say 10 students, they pass a BCom accounting degree at the same time, and they want to be chartered accountants, and they apply to a firm to do the articles. If, let's say, out of them, let's say there are 6, 3 white and 3 black students, and the probably that those 3 white students would pass. Out of those 3 of blacks, maybe 1 would pass, others won't pass. Again, it means there's gatekeeping. As we speak today, if you're an academic and you want to publish a paper, there are journals across the country that have gatekeepers. Look at the editors of journals that we have. And if you're a black sort of academic who is not known in the field, you have the paper you want to publish, it may come back to you 5 times for corrections. Somebody else, it gets in there, it gets in. First time, it passes and is published. Gatekeeping, how race is being used. Gatekeeping, that happens as we speak today. And it's a thorny issue for people who are in academia. They know what I'm talking about. In the workplace, they know what I'm talking about. Now, I want to then go to talk about language, again, which is also another challenge. We as parents also are a problem. We are a problem as parents. Some of us who are we talk about middle class, I don't know what that's middle class anyway, middle class, we send our kids to this town school, you call them formal schools, and when you are asked to choose languages, either to be taught, to study, well, English will be the language of learning and teaching, is fine. There's Afrikaans, there's French, there's German, there's your Xhosa or Sotho or Zulu or Tswana. Most parents, they don't want their kids to do Xhosa, Zulu or Sotho or Tswana. Ask why is that? Because they think that when these kids can speak maybe English, German and French, they sound cleverer than those who speak Xhosa or Zulu or Tswana. Language is a problem. Until we address those issues as black parents, we ain't go nowhere about these issues. The third one, about culture.
Very quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. About culture. What I could learn to say, but anyway, about culture is that some cultures, someone said they are backwards. They said, they are termed as stagnant. They are termed by people as barbaric. If I saw a cow or a goat in my house, before I know, I see a car from SPCA coming to my house. It's my culture. I know what I'm doing. It's my culture, but those things happen because of social classification. Stratification is there. It happens. The question is, how then do we react, or how do we act so that these things come to the fore and people understand them and be able to act in a proper manner so that they understand that we are a people in the society and we're doing things because they are part of us as a people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have quite a number of questions, and some of them are addressed directly at certain panelists and others are more generic. I want to just quickly reiterate Lorna's point about if I abandon the labels and the language, then there's a sort of a retort that I don't understand. I don't get traction in some of my conversation. I think that's an important point, and it's a very practical consideration to take forward. The issue of class, I think some of it has been answered by Rustam, but please come in on that issue when you want to. Specific question for Ayanda on the reply that you received on the colored question in your class. And then the issue that Kafui raised about where are white people in this debate, and what is the reason that this debate, all the hard work is done by people of color, as she indicated. And Ndumzi talking about gatekeeping and issues about the backwardness of culture as identified in his, or the backwardness of certain cultures as imposed onto debate by others. Can I start with Asanda, your response?
Thank you for the questions. So the question about how did students respond to the colored question or unpacking the issue of colored identity. So as I've already said, I had a lot of parents. I had parents coming to the institution to complain. I had students threatening to boycott some of my classes. And I had very interesting times, I think, if I can put it like that. But what was amazing that came out of that difficult time, and it was a difficult time for me because I had to question what I was doing and why I was doing what I was doing. And when faced with the question of whether I should continue in spite of the response, or if I should actually leave this topic for somebody else to tackle, I found myself going back to my own experiences as a black woman in media. And I understood that as a person of color in a newsroom in South Africa, you are erased, your culture is questioned, your religion is questioned, your ethnicity is questioned, and your core and your essence is questioned. And so for me, it became very important for students to understand their identities, because it is only when you understand yourself that others cannot use who you are against you. And so what was important for me was to ensure that students did not get into newsrooms and be forced to engage in opinion pieces that concerned themselves with what was happening in Rondebosch when they lived in Bonteheuwel. And so it was important for me to get students to a sense of self that was not necessarily only rooted in race or class or gender or religion, but rooted in whatever it is that they felt was important. And so race, class, and gender became the starting point to wider conversations about identity. And I think that where I saw some success is when a former student of mine wrote an article during the water crisis about how her family had been living on less than 50 liters a day. And for me, that's when I felt that, in spite of everything that had been going on, the exercise was worth it. So how I did it essentially was that we developed digital stories with students where the question was, the following questions were asked. The first question was, who are you? So in terms of race, class, and gender, what is your worldview? And who is the person that most influenced your worldview? And how do you think that who you are, as well as your worldview, is going to influence the work that you do as a journalist? And I got a wide range of responses from, apparently I'm colored, but I don't think I am, I don't tick any boxes, to I identify as colored and I'm proud of being colored, to people avoiding to talk about race completely and talking about gender and their experiences as women, and a variety of varied responses to this issue. But what was really interesting for me was how in the first year, it was mostly, I reject this term, I reject this. In the second year, when we did it, people were very proud and people interrogated and questioned and were able to critique themselves and their sense of identity better. In the third year, we had moved so far that instead of talking about colored identity as an identity standalone, racially based, we were now talking about internalized racism, within the black community in general. We're talking about colorism, we're talking about what it means to speak in a certain way and live in Hanover Park, etc., etc. And so the conversations framed and shifted and moved towards a more futuristic understanding of self as time went by. It could be that I was also getting better at managing these conversations and delving deeper. It could be that because students were hearing from previous students what to expect, they were better prepared. I don't know, but that was the response, yeah.
So I'm going to respond to all the questions, kind of integrate my responses, so I'll be quick. I think of Abdullah Ibrahim, who used to be Dollar Brandt, and I'm saying that specifically. In a documentary, he says, what apartheid did was it made mad people of all of us. It required of white people to believe that they were superior, and it required of black people to behave as if they were what they were being defined as. And then I want to go through Teresa de Lauretis and through the feminist scholarship, where she, in this analysis of feminism and semiotics, says, we think when we fill out the form, we tick the M or the F box. We think we choose which toilet to go to. But actually, the mark has already been made on us. And I want to go then through Toni Morrison, who says, racism is a distraction. It requires of you to justify. She says, they say you don't have kings, so you produce kings. They say you don't have writing, so you produce writing. There will always be that thing that you don't have. And so I'm less interested in a repertoire of my own experiences of racism, because, like Rustam, we all experience racism every day if you live in this world. I mean, just listening to the UN General Assembly, you're the object of racism. We're not doing globalism, we're doing patriotism. We will close our border, right? You've been subjected to it. It's not your choice. You may not read it as racism, but it's certainly racist in its inflection, and therefore the consequence of it is deep racism. But in South Africa, there's a reason the majority of the people engaged in this conversation are who they are, because they are the majority. And I think I take hope from that. I don't go into these spaces looking for conversations with people who aren't interested in the conversation because they don't come. I take the conversation to them. So recently, just as an example of this, I was asked to talk to farmers in the Eastern Cape about land reform. So I went in knowing exactly what I'm going to get, and it was exactly what I'm going to get. Right? So it's one of those South African spaces. I'm the only person who is not white. So I'm the only black person in the room. And so I'm invited in. It turns out that there are no women farmers either. The women who are present are wives, and they're having a Women's Day. But in the space, it became clear to me that talking to people here was about, and this is where I think specificity and accuracy in talking against racism is crucial. Find out what it is they have in common. That is identity, not the thing that makes you special. That isn't identity. The very word identity, to go back to colored, is a past participle. Identity is what do you have in common with other people, right? So in farm communities, that's often language, it's often religion, it's often an investment in children's futures. So let's build community around that. Instead of let's build community around spatial divisions, hierarchized racial difference, and get people to think imaginatively about how community can be configured differently. So in South Africa, there's a reason people are in the spaces that they are in the ways in which they're in those spaces. And I'm not reading that as pessimistic, I think that is optimistic. In Cape Town, the fact that the majority of the room is black, that's great for me, right? Because I don't have that when I go to the restaurant. Which again is not just an example to deride Cape Town, but is to show to you that I'm not sitting here going, this doesn't work through me. So when I sit in the restaurant, I see that people look a particular way and the distribution is a particular way, which means race works itself through me. And I have to think very carefully, as we all have to all the time, what is the consequence of that? What does that mean for me and my thinking? So that I don't become the self-patting progressive, virtue signaling, oh, I'm beyond race. Because none of us are beyond race. Because that's the tension between ascription and self-identification. I self-identify for very political, personal history reasons as black with a big B. But I know that I live in a world where other forms of being are ascribed to me. And so my self-identification clashes with that, and that does it for a lot of people, which brings me to Lorna's point. Not being understood is the condition of life. And we need to start teaching people to accept living with that. So I'm not saying this to you. The reason most people don't is because they constantly, you need to feel comfortable all the time. It's like this American sitcom version of the world. No, you don't need to feel it. The majority of people on the planet don't, and this is not about you. It's about using that term that you used to remind all of us that discomfort is productive. And so specificity and accuracy, and my last point is, when we start thinking about and against racism in South Africa, there's the shorthand stuff that is as bad as the racism that engenders the stuff we... So people go, 1652s, and you go, no, actually that only applies in a particular part of the country. If you are in Gauteng, it's not 1652. It's far more recent. So you have less work to do, right? So you have the title deeds, you have the wars. When the wars were being fought in that part of the country, it wasn't being fought in the terms of we have today. So why are we projecting these terms into the past? Coloured as a term was defined in colonialism in particular ways for particular reasons. It then gets taken up by apartheid for different reasons in different ways. It has the consequence of labour preference policies, whether you worked in Woolworths or not in Woolworths in 1987 or 1992, these consequences are there. But that doesn't mean that somebody today has those same consequences. So therefore, what are we missing out on the chances that that person is being given or the chance that person is not being given? So when it comes to reparation, specificity and accuracy for me are important. And that's where I think the class issue is crucial. What lens are we using to decide that people need reparations? Because some of us were not really physically, internally, individually dispossessed. But if we fall under a category that gets repossession, we get additional wealth, which means the unequal society we live in gets perpetuated with a new tincture, which is not my vision of the future. Thank you.
Desiree.
Not sure what to say. Maybe I can just, following Asanda's lead, talk a bit about my experiences of teaching a young generation of people who define as coloured, who are very, very desperate to give substance to this idea, which for me is just very bizarre because I have a strong sense of I identify as black in the Biko sense. And I find that when they try and give substance to this, it's always very arbitrary and random and frenzied. So there's this desperate effort to pin down what it means to be coloured, often with reference to this weird notion of this is my culture, which is also kind of, this attempt to pin it down. And I find that, this is for me always such a problem because culture is then defined as this fixed set of things which doesn't shift and which people believe that they carry around with them. And of course it doesn't work like that. So anyway, that's kind of responding to two comments. Just about Lorna's point, and maybe this has been brought up by Angela and Rustam, racial discourses are very hegemonic. It's not only the politicians that are manipulating the language of race, but the mass media. I mean, you don't find SABC programs that give you a kind of a critical history of racial thought. You find a lot of SABC programs about coloured people or about black people. So it's kind of constantly stressed that this is it. There's no other way of thinking about it. This is real. It's not that people are resistant. They are actually enmeshed in a system that is reproducing itself for other ends, and these ends are very often economic. Having said that, I distance myself from the kind of determinism that insists that race is there to serve class interests, because often racism has a kind of a dynamic of its own.
I didn't say it's there to serve.
Yes.
I said it's drafted on class.
Okay. although I'm not quite sure, but anyway, maybe someone else would like to pick up on that, because I do think that it's important to think about the politics of race as sometimes moving along a different trajectory to the politics of class, and not necessarily to say that this one is more important. Because the truth of the matter is that the politics of race can play itself out in much more painful, violent ways than the politics of class. If you think, for example, about a community where you have white working class people who interact with black working class people, and the kind of behavior that might be generated by thinking about themselves in racialized terms. So, yeah, for me, and yeah.
But is it not possible to imagine that a white working class community can interplay with a black working class community in different ways?
Of course.
And that's the point I'm trying to make. And what I'm trying to say is, yes, all the institutions in post-apartheid South Africa, all the cultural institutions, the state, television, the media, etc., are basically entrenching the language of race and doing nothing to basically get rid. And when I say to get rid of the language of race, I'm not saying I don't see race. What I'm saying is our reinforcement of racial language, where we celebrate that we're proud to be black, or we're proud to be colored, or we're proud to be white, that kind of thing, is connected to a multiculturalism that goes back to the 90s, and which is encapsulated in South Africa's rainbowism, okay? So the multicultural idea of the world is made up of multiple races, and we all should be proud of our racial identities. That's the language that I say is exactly the thing that leads and engenders the racism. So my point is simply, why is it important that you know what you are, or that you ask someone, what are you, which is a static kind of thing, and it just encourages that static. Why are you not interested in what someone does? So I like to define my self-identity is based on what I do. I'm a writer. So if someone asks me, what are you, then I say, that's not an interesting question, or that's the wrong question. Don't you rather want to know what is it that I do before you want to know what I am? Because I'm a changing person. I'm not something static that racial labels exactly want to do. So my point would be, the more we continue to use the language of race in everyday conversation, I'm not talking about critical race scholarship. I'm saying the hegemony of racial language in South Africa, where in almost all sorts of interactions with each other, we are constantly using the language of race. And that leads to prejudging people, etc., etc. So, my point is simply the identity politics tied to race is a dead end, and that's why I'm skeptical that we will ever get rid of all of the other stuff that starts happening, because we still see the world in racial terms.
Okay, well, we shouldn't have a monologue, so let's move it on.
More questions from the audience, and in order to make that work, they're going to have to be crisp and short, and then I think the panel is going to have a chance to give closing statements. But I'm sure you have comments that you want to bring in, and please make them as briefly as possible. I'm going to count some hands, starting at the back there. I see in the gray top, that's number 1. The green top, number 2. I see number 3 here, the lady in dark blue. That's number 3. Number 4. Number 5 behind that. And that's where we're going to have to close it. And please make your inputs very short. Number 1.
Hello, my name is Muhammad Khalid, and my question is around politicians and race. So there was a lot of discussion about the influence of politicians on race, or the way in which politicians actually use race to carry forward their agenda. So there's lots of scholarly works done, as mentioned, regarding critical race theory. And basically, I would like to know what is being done using this critical race theory to try and actually get the politicians to discuss things in this fashion. So the reason for this is because, as we understand, politicians actually have a significant control over the population. So they govern exactly where the population goes and how they're actually going in that route. So based on that, for this discussion to actually be of significant value, we need to obviously have processes and protocols in place to allow for what is discussed to actually be carried forward by the politicians itself, so that they don't actually carry on and make worse the race situation in South Africa.
Thank you. That's point well made. Number 2 in front, please.
Hello, yes. My question is, quite a few of the panelists, I think at least 2, talked about the importance of anti-racism. And apart from obvious things such as educating and changing the conversations we have with children and so on, how do you see anti-racism, perhaps, because I can probably count on one hand the number of cases I know where people have actually been criminally charged for racism. So, you know, how do we expect society to change when people actually aren't being held accountable? I suppose that's the short question.
Thank you. Short is good. Here in front, yes, ma'am. Right here.
Okay.
I actually meant the lady behind you. Sorry, because you would have a second bite at the cherry. So let's take that one first. Thank you.
You know, what this reminds me of is, you know, I've been having a altercation with some trans people for a few months, and it sort of ended with me saying, don't call me cis woman. I did not name myself cis, and I permit nobody to name me. I name myself. And that goes back to a long history of precisely the imposition of the legal term colored. You know, there were uprisings, movements were started, people began the armed struggle over the imposition of identity from outside. So it's a sensitive point, and like Lorna, I get kind of taken aback when, you know, so somebody who wasn't even born when the struggle began kind of goes, oh yeah, you're colored, and I go, huh? Like, what gave you in what army? You know, because if apartheid couldn't do it, you know, what makes you think you can? But I then began to explore that question quite constructively, as in, what is the work of power that is being done when somebody else identifies you, calls you out of your name? And Rustam, I think, what it does, it enables the work of class to be done, because if we're going to phrase issues of reparations for colonialism, genocide and slavery in racial terms, which legally don't exist since the abolition of the Population Registration Act. I mean, all we've got is the Employment Equity Act, which is written in Biko's terms. It defines black as a black consciousness. That's all we got in a legal sense. And I, in fact, know at least one white academic that regularly classifies himself as Indian to access it. There's no legal reason why he should not. Doesn't mean people should copy. But what it does, it allows us to ignore the work of class. It allows the black with a small b middle class to ascend to material wealth without having to do the work of social justice. So the 50% unemployment in this country, which anywhere else in the world would be a national crisis, is not what we're talking about, right? Because we're talking about colored and quote-unquote African. 70% youth unemployment is not an issue. So I see sort of the resurgence of this identity, which gives people of my generations, like the complete horrors, something like sort of the reclamation of the term queer, or the reclamation of the term dyke, or the use of the word nigger in hip-hop, as in, we're taking this term and what is that a response to? Is it our generation's failure to provide basic education? Is it that we as the black consciousness have not been out there in the communities educating? So those are the kind of questions that it leads me to. So I would be just interested in hearing your response on that.
Thank you. Next to you.
I think about race and gender in a way of ownership and property, right? And when I think about race and gender, because I think about myself as a woman first before anything, and human before anything, and as a global citizen and someone that lives my life without borders, I kind of look at race and gender and I say to myself, okay, late at night when I'm sitting in my bed and I'm thinking, and I say to myself, okay, if a white woman has a baby with a man of color and she becomes a single mother, we go after the man of color in the courts to make sure that he pays his child support. Or we go after the man of color to say, that's your baby, maybe in a moral sense. We go after the man of color and we say, you know, you had a baby with this white woman. In the reverse sense of gender and race, when a black woman has a baby with a white man, that baby is still considered colored. At what point do the children begin to say, I'm white? At what point does the white man decide that my child is white? Since we live in a patriarchal society and you are who your father is, at what point does that child say, I'm white? Like your child came to you and asked you, Dad, am I white or am I colored? At what point do you as a white man look at yourself and say, these are my children, or white men who have raped across the country and say, these are my children? At what point do they claim their children? Because we go after the man of color for his kids, because we see it, right? We see if the kid is not highly fair-skinned or even can pass as white, the kid is no longer white. I've been in situations where I'll check white when I go for a job interview. At what point can you tell me I'm not white? My question to you is, at what point do white men claim their children? As the way we have men of color, we go after them, we almost lynch them to claim their children. So at what point does that happen? That's my question.
Sure. We have the question there at the back, number 4.
Good evening. My name is Brian. It's more a remark than a question. I come from a South African National Defence Force background. I've been in defence for over 20 years. I still remember in 1994, I was in London when South Africa joined the Commonwealth in Westminster Abbey Church. I was present in that moment. But what I've seen within the Defence Force community is that, and this is basically my argument that I have at the current moment. This is a very, I think this topic that we're discussing right now is a very important topic. Just a pity we don't have a hierarchy or powerful people that makes decisions in South Africa to be here. Because if change doesn't happen on top, then basically we will still suffer the consequences of that. And one of my arguments I had with the South African Navy was, and I'm still fighting a court case with them in a high court, because I took them on, because I believe that they have become very racist towards so-called colored people. And they are building a South African defense force made out of blacks, and not embrace the others into the South African defense force. And I look at their policies, and I challenge them on their policies. I said the policies is not only there for the blacks, it's there for the so-called coloreds, it's there for women, but they are not advancing. Somewhere we are missing the link, because I was excited when we joined the Commonwealth. I was excited when South Africa had a change, but what we're doing in practice, we are demoralizing others and we become more superiors. And I said, this is a very important platform here, but I would have loved that the people that makes decisions and the powerful people to be here, because if they don't change, they normally say in business that a shark gets rotten from the head down. Now whatever happens there comes down to the other parts of the body. And so the only comment that I make that I find this very interesting. It's a very powerful debate. I think what we need in South Africa, we need to talk more about it, because that is going to help South Africa to heal, because we're far from healing. And the people with power is not really helping to create that space and environment like we're doing now in order to heal. We need to talk about topics that is relevant, topics that matters, and it brings change. And when we are challenged, when we ask the right questions, we get the right answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last question, number 5, was, I think, one row back. Am I? No more questions. Okay, we've exhausted the questions. Thank you very much for those last round of statements from the panel, and also helped me to answer the question that was posed to me. It was a very difficult one. Can I start again with Asanda?
Again, thank you for all the very thought-provoking and challenging questions. I think, as has been said earlier about needing to stop looking externally for solutions and rather beginning to look internally, and realizing that as we sit in this room, we all have the answers to a lot of these questions. And just because we sit on this panel, it doesn't necessarily mean we'll have all the answers. But my attempt to just answer just some of them is, in my classes, I normally combine, or I talk collectively about race, class, and gender, because I believe the three sections work together and they inform each other and they have an interplay. And I quite like the question about class, because for me, one of the very interesting debates that nobody is talking about is the fact that we talk a lot about some of the conflict, for instance, what I have earlier termed as the conflict between Africans and so-called colored, within so-called colored communities, for example. But we don't talk about the fact that that conflict itself could actually be a class conflict, because in terms of apartheid, to be black in the African sense was to be poor. And the question I always ask my students to think about is the fact that even in a supposedly in a post-apartheid South Africa, we still have houses in Langa which are cheaper than houses in Athlone, and cheaper than houses in Pinelands, and cheaper than houses in areas that are further from the city. So if you think about how property prices are supposed to work, it's supposed to be the city center, and the closer you are to the city center, the most expensive the property becomes. And so in South Africa, we have black people who, because of our history and our present, will take their middle-class black selves and move to working-class colored neighborhoods, so-called colored neighborhoods, and move to working-class so-called Indian neighborhoods, and move to working-class so-called white neighborhoods. And what then happens is a very interesting conflict that sometimes gets read as racially, which it is, because all interactions, as far as I'm concerned, between people of different races are racialized. But also we don't interrogate the class aspect of it. The fact that what does it mean for a black middle-class person to live cheek and jowl or right next to a white working-class person? What happens there? And how do they build as neighbors a common sense of self when they are divided by both race and class? And what happens when the children of these people interact, who are both racially and class differentiated in the South African sense? So thank you for that, the class question. And then the other thing I just wanted to talk to was this idea of where is the missing link, and how do we understand ownership? And I think that, again, I really believe that it's going to take a long time for us as South Africans to come to answers around those questions. But I think it's only when we understand and make a concerted effort to pass down the heritage that is knowledge of who people are, or rather who people's families are made up of, etc., that we are going to be able to move beyond the current race and racialized notions of self. Because if people don't understand where they come from, then it becomes difficult to talk to where they're going. And I think it's very instructive that my classes started out with denialism and acceptance of identity and landed up being what, if you had asked me, what I really wanted was for people to grapple with what it means to be black in the space that is South Africa, and how do we engage, and how do we, how do we survive, exist, and think about who we are and the experiences that we face, and so my classes have now become less about talking about blackness in relation to whiteness, or coloredness in relation to blackness or whiteness, and have become more about, as people of color, what are our collective experiences and how do we engage in them? And that's where the future lies, in having those conversations and in helping people understand that my identity and my affinity to my identity doesn't have to erase yours. Thank you.
Okay, so what I'll do is wrap up for myself as well. For me, there's a distinction between leadership and what it is I want to do. So I go via Edward Said's notion of critical literacy. So you make sure that the citizens have the tools to hold the politicians to account. Because for me, it's bottom up. This top-down stuff has been, again, mapped onto us. This idea that the fish rots from the head is a cliche that comes out of the ANC's talk, right, about certain kinds of leadership changes that need to happen. I'm much more interested in bottom-up, because you can change the politicians. If you don't change people's expectations of politicians, you get the politicians you deserve. And so for me, there's a bottom-up approach, which is educational. It's slow. It's at the pace of trees walking, to quote Toni Morrison. But it is an important process to go through. We are not in 2018 where we were in 1994. We are not where we wanted to be, but we are not there. And I think that is the slow march of trees. And so in response to that first question, I think, for me, leadership is dealership. I'm not interested in it. I really don't care what the politicians do. I mean, I do care at some level, but my intervention isn't there. My intervention is at the everyday level for the 55 million people who are governed by those 2,000 people. On the question of accountability, I don't think that a state mechanism or a government legislature mechanism is the only way to have accountability. It will go some way towards it, so you criminalize it, you prosecute people, but the accountability must also lie in and across all of the other social institutions of this society. And that includes the kinds of sanctions that we would have if somebody was abusing my child in my presence. What would be my sanction to that person? I wouldn't just expect the criminal justice system to intervene. There would be social sanctions. This person would no longer be in my life, and they would be excised out of my life, and anybody who sides with them would pay the price. If you say that this person did not do anything wrong to my child, I would cut you out of my life even if you weren't that person. But when it comes to racism, we assume that people can continue to be good CEOs, wonderful GP. How can a GP be a good doctor if they're a racist? Right? How can you be a good scientist if you're a racist when so much of the world is blind to you, or you are blind to so much of the world because of race? It's the same with sexism. We know from feminist work that actually patriarchal science is bad science. Why do we assume that racists can be good scientists? That blind spot is just not there. In terms of Yvette's point, I agree with you. It's absolutely about this interpolation of people into understanding terms, and we must take responsibility for not having done a certain amount of work or failing to get that work to kick in. But we can also hold accountable systems at the moment that don't do that work. We don't have an anti-racist basic education system. We have a system that pretends to be non-racial, and we're reaping the fruits of that rotten tree. The top-down change I've done. The issue of ownership for me is, and this is what I want to conclude with, I don't think it's just about ownership. It's also about belonging. And here I'm thinking through somebody like Bessie Head. It's not just about I own this, and so I own this culture, I own this land. For many people, that's never going to happen in this most unequal society in their lifetimes. They're not going to own land, but they need to have a sense of belonging, and a sense of belonging that is imagined differently from the way in which it currently is. It's not that I own this language, I belong to this language because I dream in it. I speak to my children in it. I read its poetry. And I think for millions of South Africans, they are given this idea that you must own the thing precisely because they don't have a true sense of belonging. Because the test of literacy in your mother tongue is not whether you can speak the Demotic. It is whether you can read and write in it, because that is where the consequences of power work themselves out. You may claim that this is your mother tongue, but if you can't read and write in it, there are all sorts of consequences that follow from that disempower you quite profoundly. And once a year, you're being asked to don the costume. For me, culture is what you do every day. It is not the costume that you don on special occasions. That's something else. And I think to start encouraging people to think of culture as what we do every day is to empower them and to think outside of these raciological categories that limit them and say, you must be the subject of race, not the citizen of a democracy that can hold politicians to account and say to them, not in my name, because I am not that name. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not going to respond to specific questions, but maybe to a kind of a general current. Actually, Rustam and I are obviously saying much more similar things than might the impression we might suggest. But I don't understand this whole thing of a quest for identity. I really don't get it. And I can't understand how it is that people believe that somehow they're going to find fulfillment through this finding of this thing. And I'm still trying to grapple with why it is so urgent and important for young people today. Because for me, a sense of being human, a sense of being free, a sense of being fulfilled comes from constant shifting, constant questioning. So I think in some ways this whole quest for this thing is something that in itself needs to be contextualized and explained, not only in terms of race, but in terms of other identities as well. And thank you, that's all.
Thank you, Rustam. You have the last word.
I don't have any answers. I don't have solutions. I'm a critic of failed revolutions, and I remain skeptical and pessimistic that this race and racism thing will ever be resolved. I think we're on the wrong path, and yeah.
Up to me to lift the spirit again after I'm going to try my best. I at least had a very thought-provoking afternoon. I've really been challenged also in my own thinking and my own appraisal of these issues, and I think it's been a very rich debate. I think all of us take away different things from the afternoon. For me, one of the key takeaways is it's not about race as a concept, it's about the consequence of racism. How do we fight that? Challenging the language, which is so dominant in the way we approach each other here in South Africa. Also, for us as white people, to challenge the language around us white people being categorized as we are. The sense of self not rooted in identity is not sort of the all-encompassing concept that must dominate what we are in all respects. And taking on the discourse when needed, taking on the politicians, but also taking on each other in social contexts, not by evading race, but by taking a much more wholesome view on the issues of self and identity. And thereby also accepting and perhaps even seeking the discomfort. It's partly what we did here this afternoon, is seeking the discomfort of a debate about race and racism that we all feel awkward and uncertain about in many ways. So I really want to thank the panel, and please join me in giving them a round of applause. And thanks to Desiree for inviting me to host this panel, and thank you for the opportunity to do this. And I hand you to Ibrahim for the final word.
Thank you very, very much. Thanks to the panelists, but mostly thanks to you. I'm so glad that so many of you turned out. I dressed up especially. It's also my very good fortune for the first time coming to Cape Town in a long time and not having to do any real work other than the ceremonial thing. So I think I'm ready to be a politician. And thanks to our speakers, a small token of our appreciation, Jaap, for your very sterling work in moderating the panel, but also as director of the Dullah Omar Institute to partner with us. Thanks also to the District 6 Museum for partnering with us, and the caterers, and of course to my colleague Angelo Fick, who actually put all of this together. And so to our panelists, Asanda, and of course I wish I had vouchers for all of you, but we're a poor struggling NGO, and I hope that we'll have future events in Cape Town. And thanks very much. There's some refreshments, please help yourself, and thanks again.